The sound of laughter filled the room. It wasn't the friendly kind, the kind that warms a space and brings people together. No, this laughter was sharp, mocking, condescending. It echoed off the pristine glass walls of the high-rise office, bouncing between the polished surfaces of expensive furniture and high-tech gadgets. At the center of the ridicule stood Walter Harris, a 75-year-old delivery man, his posture straight despite the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. His uniform, navy blue, slightly faded but meticulously ironed, held the emblem of the shipping company he had worked for longer than any of the smug young men in that room had even been alive. Walter had seen it all. The changing tides of business, the rise and fall of powerful men, the arrogance of those who thought they were untouchable. And now, he stood before them once again, unshaken, holding a medium-sized package in his wrinkled hands. Yet, they only saw one thing, an old man with a dead-end job. "Jesus, how old is this guy?" one of the businessmen whispered loudly, nudging his colleague. "Maybe he's from the last century," another joked. "Do they even let people his age work? Shouldn't he be, I don't know, in a rocking chair somewhere?" The room erupted in laughter again. Walter didn't flinch. He had been laughed at before. He had been underestimated before. He had been ignored before. But what they didn't know was that today was different. Walter stepped forward, his old boots silent against the polished marble floor. He looked around at the men in suits, all young, all confident, their expensive watches catching the light. He had seen this scene before. These men reminded him of those he once worked for decades ago, entitled, self-assured, blind to their own weaknesses. He had spent most of his life delivering packages to corporate offices just like this one, watching from the shadows as fortunes were made and lost. But these men? They didn't know him. Not yet. "I have a package for David Reynolds," Walter said, his voice steady. At the far end of the table, David Reynolds, the CEO, leaned back in his luxurious leather chair. He was in his early 40s, the kind of man who had never known struggle. His suit was pristine, his smile sharp, almost cruel. "A delivery? For me?" David smirked. "How cute." The other businessman chuckled. Walter didn't react. He simply extended the package, waiting. David took his time, turning it over in his hands as if it were a joke, something beneath his attention. Then, with a dramatic yawn, he tore open the box. And then it happened. The moment David's eyes landed on the contents, his expression shifted instantly. His smirk disappeared. His hands froze mid-motion. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by something else, fear. His fingers trembled as he pulled out a single envelope, its edges crisp, its weight heavier than it should have been. David," one of the men at the table asked, noticing the sudden change in energy. But David didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his breath hitched, his knuckles went white gripping the letter inside. Walter stood perfectly still, watching him. The men who had been laughing moments ago were now silent. The air in the room shifted. No one was laughing now. While David hesitated, his mind racing, Walter allowed himself a moment to reflect. They didn't know who he was. They saw only a delivery man, someone invisible, someone insignificant. But years ago, Walter Harris had been much more. He had been in this very building before. Not as a delivery man. Not as a visitor. But as one of them. 40 years ago, he had been a brilliant financial analyst, one of the best in the industry. He had helped build companies, his strategies turning small businesses into corporate giants. He had been respected, admired, and feared. And then, they had taken it all away. Walter had trusted the wrong people. Men just like David. They had betrayed him, forced him out, taken his work, his ideas, his career. They had pushed him into the shadows, convinced he was too old, too replaceable. So, he started over. He took the only job that would take him. He became a delivery man. And for years, he waited. Watched. Planned. Until the perfect moment arrived. And that moment was today. David Reynolds sat motionless, his face pale, the envelope in his hands feeling heavier by the second. The businessmen around him exchanged nervous glances. David, one of them tried again. Slowly, David pulled out the document inside. His eyes scanned the words, and with each passing second, his breathing grew shallower. Walter didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. Because he had written it. 40 years ago. And now, everything was about to change. David Reynolds felt his hands sweating as he gripped the sheet of paper in front of him. The silence in the room had become unbearable. The same men who had laughed and made jokes just moments ago were now watching him with cautious eyes, trying to understand what had just happened. He read it again, his eyes scanning the words that seemed to gain more weight with each passing line. His fingers tightened around the edges of the document as if crumpling it could somehow make it disappear. But this was real. Walter remained standing, unhurried, his expression calm and observant. He did not appear to take pleasure in the tension that had overtaken the room, nor did he seem driven by an open desire for revenge. He simply waited. Time had taught him the importance of silence, of patience, of watching how people revealed their true nature when confronted with something they could not control. He already knew how David would react before he even spoke. David swallowed hard, desperately trying to find a way to undo what had just happened. He looked at the other men at the table, searching for support, but none of them seemed willing to intervene. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of this moment. "This can't be right," he finally said. His voice no longer carried the arrogance it had before. Now, there was uncertainty. Walter held his gaze steady. "You can call your lawyers. You can challenge it. But I guarantee they will tell you the same thing. Everything was done legally." David read it again, his eyes scanning for some loophole, some technicality that could save him. But there was none. There was no hidden clause that could protect him now. He felt a wave of heat rise through his body, as if the air itself was closing in around him. One of the men beside him cleared his throat, trying to break the suffocating silence. "David, is this true?" David didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady his breathing. Walter watched him, but his mind drifted to the past. He remembered the day everything had been taken from him. The same expressions had been on the faces of those who betrayed him. The same disbelief, the same fear disguised as indignation. Decades ago, he had found himself alone, without resources, without anyone willing to stand by his side. They had discarded him as if he meant nothing. But he never forgot. He spent the last 40 years working in silence, waiting for the right moment. He took what came, never protested, never showed a single sign that he still had a card to play. Every day, he woke up, put on his uniform, and delivered packages to men who would never give him a second glance. But behind it all, he was watching. Learning. Preparing. And now, the moment had finally arrived. David's hands trembled as he set the paper down on the table, his breathing uneven. His colleagues still waited for an answer, but he had none to give. Walter could see it, the moment David realized that he had lost. For the first time in decades, Walter allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. But this wasn't over yet. He took a step closer to the table. The men around it, who had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, now sat frozen. Walter placed his hands on the smooth, polished surface of the table and leaned in slightly. "You had no problem laughing at me when I walked in here," he said, his voice steady. "You assumed I was nothing. A delivery man. Just another old face you'd forget the moment I walked out that door." David clenched his jaw, refusing to look at him. "But I never forgot." Walter let the words hang in the air for a moment. You see, I built this company before you were even in high school. I was here when it was nothing, just an idea on paper. I put my heart into it. And then men like you decided I wasn't useful anymore. You took everything from me. You forced me out. And you thought that was the end of it. David finally looked up, his eyes burning with frustration. You can't do this, he muttered, his voice low but laced with barely contained rage. This company, it's mine. Walter tilted his head. Is it? He asked. Because, according to that document in your hands, it looks like it's mine. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. His desperation was beginning to show. This is fraud, he snapped. You can't just walk in here and take everything. Walter gave a slow nod. You're free to try and fight it. But my lawyers have been preparing for this day for years. Every signature is valid. Every contract is binding. The moment this company reached its current valuation, the clause in that contract activated. You didn't read the fine print, David. And now, it's too late. David's breathing was ragged, uneven. His mind raced for a solution, for something, anything that could undo what had just happened. Walter straightened, looking at each of the men seated at the table. Their expressions were uneasy. The realization was setting in. This wasn't a joke. The old man they had laughed at now controlled everything. And there was nothing they could do about it. Walter took a slow breath and then placed both hands firmly on the table. So, David, he said, his voice calm and unwavering. Let's talk about your future. Because as of today, you work for me. David's face twisted in fury, but he knew the truth. Walter had won. And this was only the beginning. This concludes part 2. Let me know when you are ready for part 3. David sat there, frozen. His mind was racing, but he could already see the truth staring back at him. There was no way out of this. The men at the table who had once laughed alongside him now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence shattered. They were no longer looking at Walter as just an old man. They were looking at their new boss. Walter let the silence linger for a moment, watching as David processed the reality of what had just happened. For decades, he had waited for this moment, and now that it was here, he felt no need to rush it. He had spent years being invisible to men like this, and now they had no choice but to see him. You can't just walk in here and take over, David finally muttered, his voice low but filled with barely restrained anger. Walter studied him for a moment before speaking. I didn't just walk in here and take over, David. I built this company. Long before you ever sat in that chair. Long before any of you knew what real work was. David clenched his fists. You were gone. Forgotten. A nobody. We built this company into what it is today. You had nothing to do with it. Walter let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. You think that because I was delivering packages, I was powerless? That I didn't have a plan? He leaned forward slightly. I watched this company grow. I watched the mistakes you made. I watched you take credit for things that weren't yours. And while you all sat in your glass offices, thinking you were untouchable, I was making sure that when this day came, there would be nothing you could do to stop it. David's breathing was uneven now. His mind raced, but he could see the truth in Walter's eyes. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. One of the other businessmen finally spoke, his voice hesitant. What happens now? Walter took a deep breath and straightened his posture. Now, he said, his voice steady. Now, we clean house. David's head snapped up. What do you mean? Walter looked around the table. I've been watching this company for 40 years. I know exactly what's wrong with it. The greed. The corruption. The backroom deals. The way you step on the people beneath you, convinced they don't matter. His eyes locked onto David. That ends today. David slammed his fist against the table. You can't just fire me. Walter tilted his head slightly. I can. And I am. The room went completely still. David's face turned red, a mix of rage and disbelief washing over him. You can't do this. I built this company. Walter raised a hand, cutting him off. The company was never yours, David. You just sat in the seat for a while. But your time is up. David opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say another word, Walter turned toward the rest of the men at the table. For those of you who want to keep your jobs, I suggest you start acting like you deserve them. Things are going to change around here. The businessmen looked at one another, uncertain. David, however, wasn't finished. He pushed back his chair and stood up so quickly it nearly toppled over. You're making a mistake. You think you can run this place at your age? You think you can just step in and take over? His voice was shaking. Walter met his gaze without flinching. I don't think, David. I know. Security entered the room at that moment, responding to the signal Walter had discreetly given. The guards stepped forward, waiting for the command. Walter nodded once. Escort Mr. Reynolds out of the building, he said simply. David's eyes widened. No, wait. The guards took him by the arms, pulling him toward the door. He struggled at first, but it was no use. He had lost. As he was dragged away, his voice echoed down the hall. You'll regret this, old man. You don't know what you're doing. This company needs me. Walter exhaled slowly, watching him go. The weight of the moment settled over him, but there was no regret. No second guessing. He had waited for this day for most of his life, and now it was here. He turned back to the remaining executives, his expression calm. Anyone else have a problem? No one spoke. Walter nodded. Good. He slowly pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the same chair that had once belonged to him all those years ago. He sat down, placing his hands on the polished wood surface, and for the first time in decades, he was exactly where he belonged. The men who had laughed at him were now silent. The company that had cast him aside was now under his control. The life they had stolen from him had been reclaimed. Walter Harris had won. And as he leaned back in his chair, looking out over the city skyline, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Because in the end, the last laugh had always been his. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story like this. Hit the like button if you love seeing justice served, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Walter's place? Would you have taken the company back or walked away? Share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.